In today's devlog update for Devember 14th, we're talking about YouTuberizer, the changes we made behind the scenes to caching and requesting data from the YouTube API, and potential future plans. Hello, fellas Sublime Text Fanatics. Oda Nerd here. Welcome to your Devember devlog update for Monday, Devember 14th. And today we're going to be talking about changes that I made to the back end of YouTuberizer in regards to how we're requesting data, caching data, validating requests, and good stuff like that. And as a quick reminder before we jump into that, remember that tomorrow or later on today, depending on when you're watching this, we're going live on the channel Tuesday, November 15th, and also Thursday as well, 8 p.m. Pacific time. Hop on into the channel and join the chat, watch the development happening, and it's a good time. We're really having fun hanging out in the live streams. But let's go ahead and jump into actually looking at code here. And as we can see, this is the last commit from yesterday. I've set my merge to use side-by-side diffs even in the smaller size because I find it a little bit easier to track. So what we worked on today was all of our back-end handling stuff, ostensibly to continue the work we started in yesterday where we want to actually be caching data. And I'm making some improvements to how the requests work in general as a part of this and cleaning up the whole code base as we go on. So the very first thing that we did here, way back in the 4th of November, one of the things that happened was we made a modification to how we report errors, or previously we would just return back as the result of any request that failed a string that was the error. But on November 4th, we modified that to return the error that the YouTube library returns, which is an HTTP error, which is the body of the result, and that contains a message and an error code that we now display in the panel, which works great for that. Doesn't work so great for when we generate our own exceptions. So we're fixing that up here, and we tightened up the code quite a bit. So now we catch two kinds of exceptions. If we actually catch an YouTube error, we report it the way that we always did. Otherwise, we make up a fake error, as we can see right here, with the actual message of the exception and then a special code of -1, because that would allow any code that uses these to distinguish it from an HTTP error, which is usually, not -1. So that makes these things a little bit nicer. And of course, we also changed this so that the default is failure instead of success. So we don't have to keep saying success equals false everywhere. And that was the first thing that was done. Moving on to the next thing, we actually worked on creating some data validation. And this is the one where the change today, where I actually spent a little bit of time trying to decide how exactly I wanted this to work. Because a lot of the requests that we make don't really take arguments, but some of them do. Some of those are optional, and in upcoming changes that we're making here, some arguments to requests are absolutely mandatory. So we came up with this, which is the does this show the thing? No, it does not. Okay, I wasn't sure. This is basically the whole thing here. We don't really need to read the comments, but the idea is, let me just slide that over so we can see the whole thing. What we can do is we can call this with the request that comes in, and one or two sets, not dictionaries, not lists, sets of strings that represent both required keys and potentially required keys. So what do we mean by that? We can pass this set if we want to specify these arguments absolutely must occur in the request, or the request cannot succeed. These are the mandatory required fields. For example, what we'll see in just a minute is some requests used to require you to provide a channel ID optionally. Now it's absolutely required. So you would include that here to say, no, this is absolutely required. And it will generate an error that says that there are missing required arguments and tell you what they are. This is a developer type error, so that if a request fails, instead of getting a weird stack trace that eventually traces down to us trying to access the field that doesn't exist, it'll tell us exactly, hey, you requested this thing, I need these fields, you didn't provide them. You can also optionally provide a list of any of arguments. And the idea behind this one is at least one of the arguments in this list needs to exist. And this would be used for requests that are either or operations, because there are some things that work like that in the YouTube API. For example, the channel list one, you can specify mine is true to specify that I want my channels, or you can specify a channel ID to say this, I want the information on this particular channel. So you might want to say, instead of I require a channel ID, I require one of mine or this. So both of these things do that, and they are both set operations and both optional. So technically, you can call this without any arguments except a request, and it'll just waste some time and do absolutely nothing. But if you specify required items and the list of required items isn't a subset of the arguments that were provided, it tells you that they're wrong. And if you provide the any of arguments and the intersection of these is an empty set, then that's a problem because at least one of them needs to exist. So it's a particularly small change, but it took a little bit to get right. I had to decide exactly how I wanted that to work. And then we moved on to this, validating arguments in all existing requests. And this is where we actually changed some things. So previously for playlist list, you could specify a channel ID if you wanted to do this, or otherwise it would default to mine. Now this is an example of where you could validate something as one or the other, but going forward, we don't want you to say mine equals true. We want everything to be absolutely explicit about everything. So the only thing that has an implicit mine is getting channel information, because we assume we want information on the current channel, the user that's currently logged in. So that this is sort of changed somewhat, so that instead of potentially being channel ID or mine in args that we have to inject, we just always use request channel ID. But now we have a call to self-validate request channel ID to make sure that the request actually has one. And similarly, we require a playlist ID, so we verify that's there, and we verify a video ID and video details, and also we shuffle this line around to make things a little bit nicer. And for channel details, we do the same thing there. We actually include a channel ID in here. And now I'm thinking that potentially I may have forgotten something, unless that was an example of, let's take a look. Yeah, channel. Oh, this is actually in the command, so that's okay. Yeah. Never mind. I thought that was still in the same file. So we're all good on that particular change. That was what we did there. And then we moved into some other things while I was working on. This is one of these ideas where I like to make commits, and probably a lot of people do this as well, with small targeted changes for a specific thing. But sometimes these changes come about as a result of doing other things. So as we're working on the things that ended up being committed next, I discovered this, which is that when we want to deauthenticate ourselves, this is the YouTube logout option. The deauthenticate method is used for that. And what this does is delete the file that stores the credentials that were saved when the user originally logged in. That's things like the token and the other information needed to be able to set up the request object in the YouTube library that we're using, and also revalidate certificates based on the specific hidden token that we got. And then there's two problems with this. One, the first one that I noticed, the thing that sent me here, is that I wasn't actually releasing the cache when you log out. So what you can run into a situation where you're logged in as a user, you log out, you log in as someone else, and all of the requests return the cache data from prior. So that's like an informational leak in the worst case, and an annoyance in the best case. So I fixed that. And at the same time, smart brain here occurred that this removing these storage credentials could potentially throw an error if this couldn't delete for some reason, like if the file wasn't there, which means this part doesn't happen. So we set these in the other order. Absolutely remove the object first, and then go ahead and restore the credentials, and that happens after the cache for similar reasons. This really should never happen because as it says in the comment here, the request code that in the manager that actually calls into this tracks whether or not this method was actually called. It assumes deauthenticate can't possibly fail because it's deleting a file. So it would force you to relog in anyway, and the authentication code is right here. It replaces the object by creating a new one. So we couldn't really leak things like that, but it does make things a little bit nicer. Whoops. And we'll go up to the next commit here, where we decided, or I decided rather, that I want channel details to return all of the channel information and not just the first information on a channel. And there's a little bit more work to be done on this particular thing, but for right now, we're working all of our caching until we get into the next phases, which is probably going to happen in tomorrow's live stream. Previously we under the assumption that our channel or our YouTube account really only has one channel in it. Theoretically, you can have more, but that I believe needs to be a brand account. For example, if you watch live streams where you saw me logging in way back in probably the first live stream discussing this stuff, because the very first of November was actually a live stream day. um, your Google account can have one regular channel, and then other ones are brand accounts. That's what I have. This channel is my regular channel, and my other one is actually a brand account, and it asks you to choose when you log in. So I'm not sure in what circumstances this could actually return more than one channel. I believe only if you're a content manager, like if you had like a bunch of channels under your auspices as a production house, that might be the case. In any case, we modified all of this code so that instead of storing exactly one channel's information, we store the list of all channels that come out. And so that changes a little bit about the cache. We're using a different field, and the responses change here. So we're now checking. This is another situation here where I wanted to do something. Previously, if the request didn't have this a list of items, which technically does not work, it throws an error. So I'm not entirely sure how this one slipped past me before. I think it was probably based on a very simple example that wasn't doing error checking, if I had to guess. Previously, we would theoretically just return an empty dictionary and leave it up to the person, and it specifically didn't cache it that way. I decided I don't really like that, because if there's no channel ID, there's really not a lot you can do about anything. So if the items key isn't in the response, or it is but there aren't any items in it, then raise an error that there's no channels available, so that the calling code, however many things want to call in for channel details, don't need to try and check to see if they actually got a result back. Instead, it can just get an error, and that's an easier way to go. And then we cache in the results. We need to change how we're displaying this a little bit. Previously, you see, we could say that we received channel information for ODAT Nerd, Sublime Text, Tip, Tricks, and Tutorials, but now it says how many channels there are, and it shows you the list of channels just in case. So that is the gist of that. And as a result of that change, we had to make some changes in a couple of other places. Say, for example, in the command that gets channel details, we now save the very first channel as the result just for now, and then use that as instead of the result. And similarly, the same thing happens in here as well. And then we actually can need to use that in a couple of different places in here. Now, ostensibly, what we could actually do here, and what might possibly happen, maybe in November, maybe not, would be if there's more, having these things after they log in prompt you for a channel to use too, in addition to then saying, okay, now here's the items in that. And I think the way I ultimately want this to work, because I do have YouTube channels, is allowing you to log in more than once, so that I could be logged into my main channel and my secondary channel, and then these things would ask me which one do you want to work inside of, which changes a lot of stuff behind the scenes in the network code. Currently, it assumes there's only one cached credential. There would need to be a couple of those with some extra metadata to know which one was which. This would have to create multiple things and know requests and know which one of them it could use at any given point. So there is more stuff to happen there, but that is something that is on the cards, and we're taking steps towards that now and factoring the code to look that way to make our lives a little bit easier as things progress. And keep pushing the wrong key there. And then this last change here is just some code that I have sitting. I haven't actually committed this one yet. In order to test some stuff, I'm forcing the use playlist to be true so that I can test some changes out. I've been doing that. I actually had that in place from the other day. So that's all of the changes for here. We're going to continue working on this data stuff tomorrow, I'm pretty sure, unless I think of something else that I would rather tackle instead. But I want to get this part more settled out, including modifying how the caching works, so that not only does it cache that, for example, the channels, it's storing the list of channels that came last time. So if you wanted to ask for the list of channels again, it will. I want to also augment that and other requests, so that we could say, I want to channel information for the channel with this ID, and fetch it back. So we need that cache to store not only the list of items, but also a broken out one indexing by key. Similarly for videos, that's going to be the thing that modifies this, because we want to only fetch the video information once, no matter how many times we use it in any particular session. We need to know more about it than just here's a list of things. But that's going to do it for for this particular thing. Remember, if you like these devlog updates, if you want to join in the live streams, you want to use the buttons down below my face right now, below the screen, to thumb, subscribe, and share. Ring the bell notification icon. YouTube will tell you all about those videos when they happen. You can also subscribe to my other channel, link down in the description, if you want weekly Sublime Text tutorials instead that release on a Monday. And in either of those cases, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day as I head off to edit this thing and upload it so I can get to sleep.